So, having explained the positive commandments, let's consider some of the negative commandments. Like I say, these depend on the establishment and maintaining of the positive commandments. We talked about the courts and the judges. And we're going to see that within these negative commandments, that there is no bondage involved in maintaining and keeping these commandments.
There's none?
There's no bondage in it. There's no harshness. You hear oftentimes we're not bound to the Old Testament because of the bondage of the law and how heavy all these commandments were. But when we look at the ones that we have listed on this page, like I said, next week we're going to look at the balance of them. The ones that we looked at last week were the positive commandments kept by Christians. These are the negative commandments that are kept by Christians. Next week we'll take a look at the balance of the commandments that aren't kept by Christians that we should consider keeping. We as this group keep those commandments. But we'll see that the commandments that they say that they don't keep are actually commandments that are given to be kept as everlasting ordinances, but also that there are commandments that only make the relationship with Elohim stronger than it is. So, I say there's a lot of them here, and we're not going to go through all of them. I said that last time we ended up going through all of them, but this time we're not going to go through all of them because there's like 6 pages.
No images, no items.
But regarding idolatry and related practices, so last week they said it talked about idolatry. And it said, you shall avoid idols. This time it says, not to make images for the purpose of worship. And we have some religious groups that haven't quite caught on to this. Like we talked about last week, we have saints and pictures of saints, and people pray to saints, and they light candles to saints. But it says not to make images for the purpose of worship. It says not to make an idol, even for other people. So if you're a sculptor and somebody comes and wants you to make an idol, then don't make an idol for it. Not to make figures of human beings for worship. And again, this goes back to what we see is we have the pictures of the saints, and the people bow down to the statues of Jesus on the cross.
Italian Jesus.
So, and not to worship idols, it goes back to that. Not to hand children over to Molech. Now, we don't hand our children over to be cast in the fire.
So what is Molech?
In worship of Molech. But we have a responsibility in this commandment in that we have to monitor what our children learn. We have to monitor what our children get into and what their belief systems establish. And we have to monitor what others teach them as far as there's a whole lot of influence in young people about vampirism and werewolves and wizardry and all this stuff that for mature people is harmless fun, but for young people they can really get into it. And for some mature people they'll really get into it and it can change a lot of things. So this is something that we would consider in that particular commandment today. Not to practice the sorcery of Av. And the sorcery of Av is necromancy, not to try to resurrect the dead, not to invoke spiritual mediums and things to bring back dead people, so to speak. Not to practice sorcery of Yideoni, which is basically casting spells, bringing forth familiar spirits. Again, it goes into the whole thing about mediums that they hold these seances and supposedly these dead people, the spirits of the dead people return. So it says not to do these things.
Familiar spirits.
Familiar spirits, you know. I miss my mother, I'm going to go to
Yeah.
I'm going to go to a medium and we're going to sit around and burn a candle. I'm going to slip her $50 and she's going to make me feel like my mother's there. So, not to do this. Not to study idolatrous practices. Now, this is important, and it goes hand in hand with Yahweh's commandment to the children of Israel when they entered into Canaan to not leave anything alive. Because if you enter into something fresh, having learned something, even if you walked in it for a while, and the children of Israel walked in Torah for 40 years in the wilderness, but all these new ideas hit them, and all of a sudden, wow, this is really great. And when we study other things, and this is something we can relate to today, when we study things like, for example, Kabbalah, okay? We've mentioned Kabbalah in this class. We've talked about the Zohar, and we've talked about Sefer Yetzirah and the Bahir. These are commentaries to bring the Torah up, to lift up ideas within the Torah. But to put the Torah aside and to study these things exclusively will lead you in a different direction. And it's the same thing when you study Wicca, or metaphysics is huge today, New Thoughts. These things really, really have a tendency to affect how people's relationship with Elohim grows. And it can stifle the growth and also put it into a different spiritual direction. Not to erect a pillar for people to assemble and honor. And this was, they had poles that they would erect, and they would actually worship the poles. And we talk about these in the high places. In our Native American history, we see totem poles that contain a variety of different godheads on the pole. So this is something that we shouldn't do, obviously, not to worship carved stones. Well, it goes back to not making idols, not to carve images in the stone and then worship the stones. And when we read about Abraham's father, and this is in the book of Yashar, and it's funny that his father worshipped idols. He worshipped gods made out of stone and wood. And one day Abraham decided he would go in there and break all the idols with an axe, and he put the axe in the hand of the supreme God. And when his father went in there, he got very, very angry, and he started getting upset with Abraham, and Abraham said, why are you yelling at me? Your God there has got the axe in his hand. He's the one that did it. And this is when the father realized that these are nothing but idols made out of wood and stone. So this one's highlighted, and this is actually not one that's really kept by a whole lot of Christians, but not to plant trees in the sanctuary or temple. And this is a big thing, especially around the holidays, that we see a lot of trees placed inside the sanctuary. So this is something that pastors need to get an idea that, well, maybe I should pay attention to what the Word says, as opposed to ignoring the Old Testament because I'm not bound to all that stuff. This has a lot to do with idolatry and idolatrous practices, whether their intention is, a tree has nothing to do with the birth of Jesus in December, okay? So this is something that they need to get a grip on. So do not swear by an idol or have an idolater to do so. Well, obviously we don't swear by idols. Not to divert a non-Jew to idolatry. So again, we have responsibilities as teachers, because we're all teachers, not to divert somebody's attention in the direction of idolatry in any form. And it goes on, not to love someone who seeks to mislead you with idols, not to relax one's aversion to one who misleads others with idols. And some of these get kind of harsh, but the idea behind it is that should be our attitude towards idolatry, is that we need to, just like this one says, not defend idolatry. And it goes back, not to keep evidence back, or not to withhold evidence unfavorable to the idolater. No benefits and ornaments that have adorned an idol. Not to use anything connected with idolatry. Prophecy in the name of an idol. Prophecy falsely in the name of Yehovah. Now, we're starting to change gears. Not to prophesy falsely in the name of Seh HaElohim. This is something that we take to Yeshua, that when he says not to prophesy in the name of Yehovah, not to prophesy in the name of the Father, there's a word, an Aramaic word that's left out in the Greek that says not to prophesy falsely, or not to swear falsely in the name of the Father. So, not to prophesy falsely, but we shouldn't swear falsely by the name of our Elohim. Do not listen to anyone who prophesies in the name of an idol. Do not imitate or practice the ways of idolaters. This is something that we really need to look at. When we talked about a few weeks ago that we have to understand everything that we do. When we recite a blessing, when we wave the hands at Shabbat, lighting the candles, anything that we do has a purpose and a reason in our service to Elohim. When we do something that is something that's introduced, we need to take time to research the origin of that, to make sure that it didn't come from somewhere other than from Torah. Because we can get into this particular thing. There are things within Talmud that are exactly this. So we really need to weigh anything that we learn to find out where it comes from, and do we really want to, or do we need to apply it to our worship? Again, this is kind of long-winded, but these are the boards and the nails and the pitch that we have when we put together the ark. The very word is what holds the ark together. And when we step into the ark, this is what we're taking care of. We're moving the clean animals to one side and the unclean animals to the other side. So we have to know. What I would recommend with these, when we get the last copy, is maybe punch holes in them and put them into your Torah that you're compiling, because it'll come in handy later on down the road. Go on, not to practice divination, not to practice soothsaying, not to practice enchanting, not to practice sorcery, not to practice the art of a charmer, not to consult a necromancer who uses the off. This goes back to, again, not to get involved with mediums, not to get involved with fortune tellers, palm readers, this kind of thing. And we see these kind of things set up as fun and games at some Christian-based carnivals. So we have to really, really be aware, because these things have crept in, and it's okay. It's all out of fun. And it can be all out of fun for those who are mature enough to understand that it's all out of fun. But when you get immature people getting involved in these things, then it starts to drag them in a direction they don't need to go. So this is why Elohim said, don't let anything live when you go into Canaan. Don't let anything affect your relationship and your walk with Elohim. Don't seek information from the dead. Now we go on to women not to wear men's clothes or adornments. Men not to wear women's clothes or adornments. No tattoos in the manner of idolaters. Not wearing a mixture of wool and linen, shatnez. And these particular things have much deeper meanings, and when we get to them in our studies, we'll talk
Yeah, the
about
wool and linen.
you know, not shaving temples, the sides of the head in worship of idols. And this was the practice of pagans back in the day. They shaved their heads in certain ways. Not shaving one's beard as worship to idols. Not cutting one's flesh over the dead. So these are some of the negative commandments, but are any of these things do-nots that keep us in bondage? Or are they meant to make sure that we don't enter into bondage? This is something that we see here, that these are all, although they say don't do this, it's the same thing as me telling one of my grandchildren not to touch the hot stove. Because if you touch the hot stove, it's going to hurt you. And this is all Elohim is saying. If you get involved in these things, it's going to hurt your relationship with me. And it's ultimately going to hurt you. Now, we go on. Regarding prohibitions from historical events. Not to follow one's heart or eyes straying towards impurity. Show no mercy towards idolaters, not to settle in Israel if one serves a false deity. And that would apply more to the land of Israel. Not to intermarry with one who serves a false deity. Now, we see mixed marriages all the time, and we see the problems that they cause within the mixed marriage, that people aren't going to budge on their beliefs a lot of times, and it really causes a lot of problems within a relationship. Not to fear an enemy in time of war, not to destroy a fruit tree even in the time of war. So, I mean, again, these aren't very harsh commandments. And again, they're for our benefit and nothing else. Nothing here puts us in bondage. Regarding blasphemy, not to blaspheme the name of Yahuwah. Not to violate an oath by Yahuwah. If I swear by his name, I need to keep the oath that I made. Not to bring to nothing or change the name of Yahuwah. Now, small groups have started to keep this. We see this coming more and more into being, but the majority of Christians, still out of ignorance, don't keep the name, and they still bring it to nothing. Do not profane the name of Yahuwah. Again, this goes back to not bringing it to nothing. The word that they use for profane literally means don't bring it to nothing. Don't make it empty. Do not test or try the promises or warnings of Yahuwah Elohim. It's like, it's like a 2-year-old has to test his boundaries. We shouldn't even try to test our boundaries. Basically, don't press your luck. Not to leave the body of an executed criminal hanging overnight. Well, in our legal system, when we execute people, their bodies are disposed of respectfully right away. This is one of the reasons that Yeshua was taken down off of the tree right away. Regarding the temple, now this is a good one. Drunken people cannot enter into the sanctuary or teach Torah. Makes sense. Not to make any oil similar to the anointing oil of the temple. It was a set-apart oil. It was distinct for the use specifically in the temple at that time. And the one that's not to use the anointing oil of the temple to anoint anyone other than the high priest or the king. So we don't have a high priest. We don't have a king, so to speak, in earthly terms. So we have no need to replicate the oil anyway. Not to make incense similar to that used in the temple sanctuary. Again,